What's up, folks? Casual Dad here, and if for those eagle-eyed among you, you may notice that this is the second version of this video that I'm recording. I removed the original, did it late at night, I just ran through it, and I wasn't particularly happy with how it came out, so this is version 2.0. So the goal of the video today is to go ahead and run through how to ladder efficiently and effectively to kind of get above your current wall in the competitive ladder. I had a specific ask to actually show some deck builds for specific factions, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm really going to emphasize this approach for newer players or players with under-leveled cards, but I'm going to dip in and out of some other content as well to kind of help make sense of it all too, okay? A couple things I want to highlight. The ladder is dramatically different than some of my guides, the previous guides that are up online right now would indicate. The biggest changes being that they've changed the matchmaking so that there's a forced rotation. So whenever you play against a warlord, it should be much longer before you play against that warlord again. So you should see a much more diversity of warlords. So there are fewer meta-defining decks and fewer walls where you face just one or two warlords over and over and over again. So that really helps make it easier. But in terms of deck building, that makes it a little bit harder because it means that there are fewer decks that are meta-defining, which is great for the game, but a little bit tougher for making guides, right? So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I was asked to look at Eldari, Necrons, Space Marines, and Chaos. So I'm going to focus on those 4 factions. If any of you want to see more, I can also do the other 5 factions in a follow-up video. The goal here is to keep this relatively quick, fairly approachable, just kind of talk about some general points and a couple specific cards and builds, and then hopefully help you get through the hump in the ladder. A couple general notes. Number one thing I want to highlight is that your trait level. So looking right here, if you have trait rank 3, which is what you're looking at right here, of either trait, whether it's a primary, if it's a primary trait and you have trait rank 3, that is a competitive, what I would consider a higher leveled card. That is a card that you can use in the competitive ladder and can comfortably get you all the way up to the top 6% or even above in the competitive ladder. So when I'm talking about under or over leveled cards, that's kind of your baseline. If it's trait rank 2, that is what I would consider an under-leveled card. If it's trait rank 1 or below, that would be straight up a low-level card, and that will be extremely challenging to get anywhere. So keep grinding your quests and get there. But trait rank 3 is very competitive. So if I'm talking about just kind of your baseline traits, your competitive traits, that's where you want to look. And that applies to all card rarities. That was a rare. Here is a common. Right here, trait rank 3. And then if you get into the legendaries, trait rank 3 would be here, which is actually considerably earlier because legendaries are a little bit more powerful out of the gate. But with these, you probably want to be trait rank 3 and 2. So secondary trait up to level 2. With epics, you want your, again, trait rank 3. That is a highly leveled epic card. Now, your epic cards become a lot more powerful when you get them up to your secondary traits. So if you have a level 9 epic card, consider building your deck somewhat around that in a way that it can contribute value, because that's very good. You'll find that the stats to points are excellent around level 9 epic cards, and that's a good one to kind of build around. So without further ado, let's get into the actual warlords and decks. And again, I'm going to start with Eldari. We'll just go order left to right. Right off the bat, you've got your 6 Eldar warlords, Eldar. And some of these, I would consider the top 2 most competitive warlords in the entire faction Lilith, because she has that ability to reposition and redeploy cards in-game, which is absolutely huge to maximizing the value from your traits and getting the most out of cards even if they're a little bit under-leveled. So she's top-notch. Next up, I would go ahead and put the Avatar. The Avatar is extremely level-dependent, meaning he gets much, much better at higher levels and is an absolute beast when you get him up to max level, of course. No surprise there. But he does depend on thinner decks of more powerful cards, so they have to be higher level to benefit. Lilith is a little bit more flexible in that you can use those lower level traits a little bit and use them multiple times. And just being able to redeploy your cards means that if you have some high level cards and some low level cards, you can make up the difference. Lilith is extremely strong in that count. But for a starting warlord, I strongly recommend Zephyrblade. He is easily the best starting warlord because his trait, anytime any card dies, including your friendly cards, all of your cards, including those in your deck, get +3 ranged attack. Now it's a small amount, but it adds up very quickly, and if you're playing lower level games, then that adds up really fast. And if your cards are a little bit under-leveled, getting a benefit from them dying is absolutely huge. And this is still good at high level just to top off your damage cards, but at low level it's exceptionally good because that's a significant increase to your base stats. That also adds to their base, so that is also increased by Outflank, Readies, or Inspiring Presence. Any of those will then stack with that flat buff. So it's actually much better than it looks at first. Zephyr Blade is also your cheapest, so one of the best ways to start out when you're starting out in Warhammer Combat Cards is to take the cheapest Warlord of a faction and then go ahead and just fill that deck with your best, most powerful cards, whether they necessarily fit the theme or not. Zephyr Blade is very much ranged themed. He only improves ranged attacks, but being cheap, he also helps you fill the deck and stack it with your toughest stuff. So you shouldn't worry about being only on theme all the time, even if it is kind of the best, most competitive way to play. That also brings up another tangent here too. Before I get too deep, I do want to go ahead and lay out that when you are laddering in Warhammer Combat Cards, the most powerful attack type is ranged. It's just better than the others. You have target acquired, you have high damage potential, you've got a auto attack that's very common in that precision shot, so when a card drops it does attack. You've got a combination of all sorts of different traits that come with ranged attacks, but the most defining feature is barrage. If you have barrage, this is the ability where when you shoot, it hits adjacent cards too. That is huge for clearing shields, taking out injured cards, clearing the board, dealing with endless things. Barrage is a defining trait of ranged attack and is probably the single most competitive trait in the game. I'll go out on a limb and say that. So when you're laddering, that is something to keep in mind, that your ranged decks are probably going to outperform the others, just because your melee cards have to be very, very high level to be truly effective. They risk a really tough matchup. And a lot of the best warlords out there are ranged warlords who are very durable versus melee, but don't like to be shot back. So that is definitely something to consider too. Another thing too is that your stats start out low. So as your cards are under leveled, they don't have a ton of hit points. And so you'll notice the biggest difference is going to be durability. And that is why I don't necessarily recommend starting out with Rakarth. He is good, but the flat +7 to wounds is not as good as the damage buff that you'll get elsewhere. That was an extremely powerful warlord later in the game, but not great to start out just because adding 7 to 30 wounds isn't going to make much difference. If you are kind of middle upper level and struggling to progress a bit, I definitely recommend giving Illic a try. His ability is you don't even have to deal lethal damage to a card, you just have to hit it very hard. You have to deal at 65% or more of its base wounds in a single turn with shooting. You do barrage, precision shot, target acquired, all of those will stack and you will kill cards much more quickly. So if you're leaning on Eldari's already extremely strong shooting, he's a really good one to push the difference through, and that will also remove, if you do lethal damage to a card, and Akaran's ability would bring it back with 5 health, this will kill it outright. So this Bringer of True Death will trigger after that lethal hit. So this is another way to counter Akaran very effectively too. So just keep that in mind, really strong piece. That is Eldari Warlords. Let's talk a little bit about some of the bodyguards. Some key pieces here. Again, Eldari really, really do well with ranged, but right on this page we'll talk about some of the top kind of defining cards for the faction. I'm going to do this for each faction. I do want to go ahead and say they're going to be largely epic and legendary cards because those do tend to be a little bit stronger for the points. So those are challenging to level because they're a little bit less common drops, but just stick with it and you'll get there. And I will also focus on some of the commons and more easier to get cards in each faction as well. So right off the bat, this one, stupidly powerful for that ranged attack, for that points cost, and those hit points. Combination of outflank and precision shot. This is an extremely strong card. I believe it was recently switched. No, maybe not. That's correct. So super strong. If you have a decent level of this guy, consider making a ranged deck and having this be sort of the backbone of it, because he's cheap for what he gives you. I'll be talking about the upcoming balance patch soon, and he does get a nerf, but it's not one that makes him unplayable. It just makes him a slightly worse pick. But that's because Eldari shooting is so powerful. That's why he got that penalty. Now looking at these two, your Phoenix Lords, all 4 of these are really strong pieces. The strongest of them by far being Morgan Ra, again because ranged is better and because he does have the magic trait of barrage. And his range damage gets completely insane. He's still 35 points, so he's pricey. He is a little bit level dependent, so he gets somewhat weaker at this range. Level 6, even though that's only trait rank 2, is still a good spot to run him because that's a very high ranged attack for the value. Next up, we've got Jane Czar. She comes up a lot because she has fear as a primary trait and very good hit points. That combination makes her very sticky, really dangerous, and hard to deal with. If you are running a melee Eldari deck of any kind, I would consider starting Jane Czar as your core piece, the one that you have to bring every time. Next up, of course, if you're running a Psychic deck, Trialiorn the Silent is a very risky piece because he's actually very squishy for what he gives, and his hit points are quite low to start out, especially based on the cost. Once you get him to level 9, his Psychic attack is completely off the wall, especially in an Eldrad deck or where you have multiple Psychers on the board, so he gets that % buff. Super strong, but again, glassy. So one of the key decks that you see a lot is a Rakarth with all Psychers. That helps you run all of your Psykers because Rakarth himself is cheap, but then also gives you the opportunity to give them extra health and keep them on the board longer. So, good piece to look at. Other pieces, this guy comes up a lot, extremely powerful for the points, very good melee piece, and has Death Blow, which if you're gonna give up Barrage, Death Blow is the second trait that does the same thing, but of course it's dramatically weaker because your card has to die to trigger it. So he's good. He's particularly good in both a Rakarth deck because he'll actually gain some extra hit points, and also in an Avatar deck because he gets the offensive buff while he's on the board. I would also keep a close eye on Yvraine. She's about to get a big buff in the latest balance patch that I'm about to talk about in a little bit. So yeah, she's one to keep in mind, but right now she's quite expensive for what she brings. Looking into some of the other cards, some of the cards that I used a lot while I was leveling up aggressively, these two right here, either of them, whichever one is higher level, they do kind of the same thing. Both having a lot of hit points, being high initiative, so you can attack first. And they also have good ranged attacks, and the one has ranged ready, the other one has outflank. Outflank doesn't give you as big of a boost as ready, but it does give a debuff to your opponent, so they won't be hitting you back as hard on their turn. Those are really good pieces to put in here just in terms of hit points and what they do. The cheap Barrage card with some durability is going to be this guy right here. You get this guy to trait rank 3, it's another power piece, but it's a little tough to justify because it is expensive for the hit points and damage. Then this one, of course, is your primary Medicae that will heal up your cards and give them additional health. Excellent piece because it also fits either in melee or ranged, and all the way up you'll see those numbers match up. So it's one of the evenly balanced ones and has decent attack stats for the cost. But it is a little bit level dependent because you do want higher level Medicae to get the most benefit out of it. A couple other cards. This one is going to see a buff soon. Was formerly a staple, has not been up to now, but is one to keep an eye on. Amalyn just got a buff, so she is a really strong piece to look at, especially because target acquired is also a really strong piece to go ahead and choose the targets you want to remove and take care of them. Very strong in a Zephyr Blade deck because she lets you focus fire on big targets, and also has a lot of damage herself, but then also is very glassy, so she's going to die and then provide a buff to all your cards. So one of the things about Zephyr Blade is you want to kind of have a cadence, right? Where you're losing cards steadily while taking out enemy cards, but you're not losing your key pieces. So you want some of the cheaper, squishier stuff in there so you can afford the more expensive stuff to last throughout the game. Those are some of the big ones. This shield guy is a staple of a lot of my decks just because he has shields and is cheap. This one is a good one to start out because it has very good hit points for the cost and starts out with high hit points at low level. So it's a really good one when you're starting out, especially in a Zephyr Blade deck. You got your melee target acquired here. You got your staple fear cards here in both of these, your ranged and your melee. Those are both really good to fit in because they have good attack stats themselves, but also fear makes them stick around a lot longer and helps you clog up opposing lanes so you're not dying as quickly. This one also has that fear, comes up a lot. That's another piece that you really want to fit in there. And these two have precision shot, so they attack on the drop, which makes them very strong in Lilith decks, but also very strong in Zephyr Blade decks because you can hold them back. You can keep them in their deck until they build up a buff, and as they're building up that attack, that ranged attack buff, that then will mean that when they land, they hit much harder. So that is, you can play them early and lose them, or you can play them late and have them hit harder. These two also are worth considering. That outflank is nice, that barrage is nice. They're both very cheap, die extremely quickly, but can also punch hard for the cost. And then this guy is now Medicae. Your 10-point Medicae is a really good piece to include in there as well. Hopefully that was helpful with Eldar. I'm going to take a look at a couple of the decks that I have, just to kind of talk through them a bit. There is my Lilith deck. Leans really heavily on ranged, but does have a sprinkling of melee, both to go along with Lilith herself, because she has melee, but also because this is a really sturdy taunt, this is a very sturdy shields, and this is a target acquired that is a little bit cheaper than the ranged one, so it fit with the other cards I wanted to run. You see a lot of on-the-drop abilities, Medicae, taunt, target acquired, precision shot, outflank, precision shot, barrage. Those all benefit from Lilith because every time you redeploy them, they trigger that trait again. Very strong deck. Also to look at the Zephyr Blade deck, mine is a little bit weird now because I'm leaning heavily on the area effect psychic cards because I've gotten them very high level. If you have cards of these rare cards, or excuse me, these epic cards around level 8 and 9, consider this as a way to get bonus extra damage. Really powerful for stripping shields and making sure that things are vulnerable to your follow-up ranged attacks. If you're lower level, below trait rank 3, I would not run either of those because they are way too expensive to play until their stats get high enough. So that was Eldar. We're going to jump to the next faction. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. If you want to talk about the specific cards you have in any of these, I can talk in more detail specifically to that, either in the comments or in a follow-up video. I'm going to go ahead and jump to Necrons. Now, Necrons are a little bit tougher. Still, it holds true that ranged is the strongest attack type. And so the Stormlord is pretty good at high level because he has a really strong ranged attack himself, synergizes with your cards. My personal tip for leveling up and playing early is going to be the Nemesis Zandrek, because he is 2 cards in 1, which really, really helps kind of fill out your deck. So when he is first attacked, you put him in play, he takes damage. He is instead replaced with a taunt card that keeps your other cards alive and lets you keep him in your back pocket to play him again later. Also has balanced stats of both ranged and melee. His other ability to kind of up and down your, to buff either melee or ranged in-game is kind of just a perk. I would never play around it because it's too unpredictable, but it can be gravy in those turns when it happens to be a ranged buff when you're shooting. Necrons also have very, very strong shooting cards, so he really plays into that because he has the potential to buff ranged attacks, even if he doesn't do it all the time. Uthakar is very range dependent and fairly weak right now. Trazyn is so gimmicky. He's one that you want to play, but he really is very challenging because he's just... you try to get the gimmick to work all game and it can distract you from winning. At least that's what happens to me. The starter Warlord, of course, has the advantage again of being the cheapest, so you can take your most powerful Necron cards and just stuff a salad deck in there, and he's a good piece to go ahead and start with, especially when you're just starting out, which is great because he's the starter Warlord. The Silent King is a really powerful new piece, but I would not touch him with a 10-foot pole until you have very high-level cards, including him. So he's not one I would play at level 1. Definitely not. So I'm not going to talk about him much in this guide. To talk about some of the defining cards for Necrons, the C'tan are mainstay cards. You got your Sun Eater, you got your Magladroth, Nightbringer, and then your Deceiver. And whichever one of those you have at the highest level is a really good starting point to just build a deck around. I usually don't recommend including more than one unless you're going to go all in and bring just those. And if you do that, they better be very high leveled. Let me pop back up to the top real quick. I do think that the strongest competitive Warlord in Necrons, hands down period, may be the Silent King, but only if he's very high level. But the Manifest Nightmare is incredibly good. If you have a card and it's attacked by an attack type it doesn't have, so a pure melee card gets shot, a pure range card gets punched, it will reduce that incoming damage by almost half. And that stacks with Fear. It stacks with Outflank, reducing attack damage, so it can make your cards ludicrously durable no matter what level they are. So what I personally consider the absolute strongest deck out there for Necrons, period, is your Manifest Nightmare with heavy ranged, where they only do mono ranged attack and have Barrage. Necrons have some of the best Barrage cards in the game that are mono Barrage, this one being, I think, the best, and this one being a close second. This one being a little bit better because it's faster to level and is cheaper. This one also having that secondary outflank and much higher hit points once you get to that trait rank 3. These are really powerful pieces, and they are almost impossible to get rid of if they're in a Taunt, Medicae, Manifest Nightmare deck. So certainly consider those as strong pieces. And another bonus is that if you have a mono attack type deck, say these are both just ranged, if you then also throw in a mono attack type melee, whenever you do the ranged attack you want to, that melee card will then ready and give you the ready value you want. So that's something to consider in there when you're deck building. Some other mainstay cards in Necrons, you will see this one a lot because it's relatively cheap, has insanely high range damage, and has shields. So it sticks around for a long time. It's very hard to remove, and since some of the most dangerous decks in the game are ranged, it will shoot back. So it's a great piece to consider. Another one that comes up a lot is Seamet. This one is incredibly strong, just coming with great stats, Inspiring Presence, and shields makes it also very difficult to remove. That's kind of a signature of Necrons, is they do a lot of damage, but mostly they're hard to kill. Now, he's not as good in a Manifest Nightmare deck because he does have both melee and ranged, but he doesn't have Psychic. So every single Necron card will benefit against Psychic decks if you run them in a Manifest Nightmare deck. So if you're struggling against Psychers a lot, that's a really strong Warlord to consider. Also just one of my favorites. This one is your cheaper Inspiring Presence. Not as common or as good as Seamet, but dramatically cheaper. So certainly worth considering to throw in there, especially once you get to the higher trait level. He is a whole lot more fragile, though. So yes, he is cheaper, but he's, you get what you pay for. Kind of cruising up a little bit. All of these, the target acquired, Medicare, Outflank, Medicae, those come up quite a bit. If you have a high level one, throw them in there. If you're running a melee deck, this thing is a beast. This thing was made to go with Uthakar, great stats, and that heavy melee hit can also be good if you do a mono melee Manifest Nightmare, but it's going to struggle behind the ranged Manifest Nightmare decks. Cheap Medicae here. Let's get over. This shielded card is a really common piece just to hold down a lane. This Taunt is one of the best taunt cards in the game, a really strong one to consider putting in your decks. This is an extremely strong Endless card, and likewise the Scarabs are very strong. Scarabs aren't as strong because they're melee only, and they don't. They have very low hit points, so they're very fragile. But they have a melee ready. So it's just talking about having a mono range deck where you sprinkle in a couple mono melee cards so that they will apply a debuff. An active melee debuff for a 4-point card is really good kind of bonus tech to put in your heavy range decks. Then we've got, of course, this guy right here, also mono melee. Doesn't have as useful of a ready, but he's only 6 points, has good wounds for fear. Great, very cheap piece to hold down a lane, decent in your melee decks. And then, of course, you've got your cheap target acquired as one very strong one to consider in your range decks, too, to help you kind of take out the cards you needed to take out. Two of the strongest traits in the game are shields and fear. Hitting those from multiple targets will help deal with shields. So if all 3 of your cards hit one thing, they'll clear its shields faster. And then fear is much easier to deal with from off lane. So this helps you take out fear cards without having to punch through that fear damage reduction. That's kind of the key piece for Necrons. Necrons generally have very strong stats. So you just want to kind of double down on that and use whatever theme builds around your highest leveled cards, and that should help you kind of punch through to higher level. My highest rank deck I've ever gotten in Necrons was 3,200, 3.2 thousand trophies, and that was with that heavy ranged Manifest Nightmare. I did not use this because mine is very low level. Once I get that to higher level, that deck should easily be a 3.5k deck. Going to go ahead and jump onto our Space Marines. This one I'm going to touch really briefly because there's so much to talk about in Space Marines. You've got 9 warlords. Of these 9, there are only 3 I would consider true starter warlords, and that's these 3 right here. At upper competitive levels, Helbrecht is a complete monster and is one of the exceptions to where melee is weaker than ranged. He will just wreck opposing decks and if led to roll. Azrael is about to get a buff, and I consider him extremely strong too, especially feeding into the flexibility of Space Marines, but mine, of course, is only level 2. So he's very level dependent because he himself is expensive, and his stats suck until higher level. Voldus is bad. I'm just going to call you out, buddy. I love Voldus. I love Space Marine Psychers. It's a cool gimmicky thing to do, but it is not competitive until you are extremely high level, and then you will only win until you run into decks that match your level, and then they will punch you smack in the face. Can be fun to play with, but I don't consider him a competitive warlord at all. Sorry, guys. Next up, of course, you've got the Primarchs themselves. I personally think the Lion is the better of the two because of his attack first ability, where your cards will hit back first. So he's got a built-in mask and then also defensive abilities himself and shields. This guy is a beast. Luckily, he's 100 points, so you can play around him, but he's a very challenging warlord to fight. Logan is also on that exception where he's an extremely strong melee warlord who is very competitive once you get to higher levels. The reason being that he gives all of your cards a built-in barrage, where if they kill a card, any overflow damage or extra damage beyond the health of that card that they kill overflows to other cards. So if you're looking to ladder effectively with a melee deck, Logan is a really good first stop. But in terms of kind of laddering in general, focusing on range, focusing on the abilities, it is these 3 right here. I'll start with the Tolmaron. He's the cheapest. So again, your best Space Marine cards, you throw them in there with him. He's a very easy piece to kind of help get value out of them. But his ability is purely based on ranged cards. So every time you have a card on the board, when you play a new card, it gets a plus 20% ranged attack. That doesn't stack, so the 20% is going to be a set amount every time, I think. Pretty sure about that. So you will see it increase the power of the cards dramatically, but it won't kind of snowball where it's 20%. So it's 120%. Then plus 20% of that is being even more. But so it still makes your powerful range cards extremely strong. That said, it is a one-trick pony, and he tends to really favor running either very soup decks where you just have a bunch of stuff in there, or have a very small deck with very powerful ranged cards that can be countered, and you will run into extremely bad matchups with Tolmaron. That said, he's a really good momentum warlord. Something I like to think about with these is since your trophy progression in the ladder is shared across all of your warlords in the faction, you want to start each season with your very, very aggressive decks, even if they're not the ones that compete aggressively at top level. The ones that win games fast, start with those, and then switch to your kind of slower, more measured, more competitive ones. So Helbrecht starting out the season, great way to go through it. Just chainsaw through some of the weaker decks and get yourself to the trophy level you want to compete at, and then switch to a tougher one. I'm going to skip for a second here. We'll talk about Acheran. Acheran is still a meta-defining warlord. He's a starter warlord. He's very common. He's like the core of the Space Marines. And his ability is that whenever one of your cards is killed, it is not killed and instead comes back with 5 extra hit points. So you have to kill every Acheran card, including himself, twice through the shields. Very tempting warlord, very good one to ladder with. He's a very effective piece, but I would caution against leaning on him as your laddering warlord because he will struggle in mirror matches. Anytime you're Acheran against Acheran, not only will the games take forever, but also you can easily be overwhelmed by different types of Acheran decks. You're running ranged, hit a psychic. You're running melee, hit a ranged. It can really be a tough matchup and not help. So the general rule of thumb when you're laddering at all is to run an anti-Acheran deck so you're not stymied by these guys. And that goes in PvP as well. Acheran himself is extremely strong in PvP, but again, mirror matches. So if you run an Acheran counter, it will tend to be effective at other things as well, but will help you ladder effectively because you're able to clear through those Acheran decks too. And that brings us to what I think is personally the strongest of these Space Marine warlords, period, but especially starting out, Watch Captain Artemis. His stats are excellent, his cost is low, he's got the combined traits of anti-infantry and then Deadshot. Especially if you get this guy to level 9, Deadshot is amazing for closing out games. If you get a close game where you're up against a warlord who's screened by bodyguards on both sides, Deadshot will let all of your cards go after that warlord and take it down more quickly and help you close out games even if you would lose if you had to go through the off-lane bodyguards first. His ability also is excellent and does not care at all what level your cards are. Every time you play a card, one enemy card at random loses 20% of its starting wounds, just flat out. If you hit the same card 5 times, it's dead. So, and that will go through shields, and it does more damage based on the health of the opposing card. So if you're struggling against decks where there's a 4 or 5 card deck where they're really, really stout cards, this will help even the playing field dramatically. Super, super good. Also, Artemis is a meta-defining deck in that anytime you see you're up against a warlord, you got to check to make sure it's not Artemis, because my instinct is also to play my toughest cards early, which is real bad against Artemis. He will immediately get maximum value of whatever he plays if you play your highest hit point card first. Very, very good. And he encourages running full-size decks. He doesn't care what attack type, so he really emphasizes the flexibility of Space Marines. You can balance out your cards that have both good ranged and melee attacks. Throw in some psychic, who cares? It's all fine to Artemis. Super, super strong piece. Still, I think my favorite of the Space Marine warlords. Azrael's up there. I got to level him a bit. But Artemis, I would say, is your starting, your competitive, your bread and butter Space Marine warlord. Looking at some of the bodyguards, I'll look at some of the ones that come up a lot and then some of the most powerful pieces, and then we'll hit Chaos. I would go ahead and skip over basically this entire bottom row, with the exception being this is a staple of your Tolmaron decks. I do personally really enjoy mixing in Sven as well, because he's got a really strong melee too, so you can fall back on a secondary attack type, and he has Death Blow. So if you're starting to get overwhelmed, you get a lot of value out of him as a ranged attacker, but then he also will help kind of make up the difference even when he goes down. Another kind of quirky one I like to throw in my Tolmaron decks is this guy, because he's got that precision shot, which is awesome, and also is impacted by your bonuses from Tolmaron. So you drop this guy and then drop your other 2 cards, he will already have a plus 40% to his base stat, which also is a plus 40% to his precision shot. He then also has Psychic, so he both will attack back against Psychers on defense and also gives you a way to deal damage without having to punch or shoot again in a bad matchup. So a good one to include. He's also cheaper than this one. Of course, doesn't have the same staggering range stat, but does have more flexibility at a cheaper price point. This one's a staple of decks you see a lot because it's common and levels quickly and has good stats. This guy is a beast in melee decks once you get him up a bit. It took me a very, very long time to get this level, and I just got it, and that's where he becomes truly nasty. Then, of course, we've got this Barrage. This is a really strong piece in your Tolmaron decks. Really helps that thin deck make up the extra difference against overwhelming decks that might bring it down. So very strong piece to consider as your staple card in your Tolmaron decks. Next up, we have one of the best cards in the game, which is Mephiston. Great attack stats, Death Blow and Fear. Very powerful Psyker, especially as you get him to a higher level. Level dependent. Until you get him to level 10, he still does struggle a little bit for the cost, but at max level or up there, this is a card you're going to see a lot and is a really, really powerful card. He doesn't necessarily fit any theme all that well, but he does fit every theme somewhat, and is a very powerful melee contender with the combination of Fear and Death Blow being the best two stats to have on a melee or psychic attacker. Very strong piece. Not one I usually deck build around because he's expensive and rare. This is another common deck to throw into your, or common card to throw on your Tol'Maron decks because he has that high stat. That Big Game Hunter really helps you clear other decks that can otherwise be hard to take down. Very good at clearing out your tougher pieces. Then, of course, you have one of the best cards in the game. He's about to get a nerf in the upcoming season, but it still doesn't make him not the best card in the game. Space Marines have several of the exceptions to me saying that ranged is the best attack type in the game. I do think that melee is very strong in Space Marines, and Asterath is the melee card of the game. He is completely bananas at max level, has that max Furious Charge and max Fear, great hit points for the cost. Like, this guy is very difficult to deal with, and is a absolute staple in Helbrecht decks, especially because their armors match. You got that gold with the red. It's perfect. Anyway. Skipping over most of these, I will say that still one of the strongest Akaran decks out there, hands down, is going to be a combination of Tigurius and Yal. Tigurius just being almost impossible to shift because he's a very durable Psyker with shields. Yal being an extremely powerful piece because he has both high Psychic and melee, and then also has that Psionic Blast, that area effect Psychic. Very, very powerful pieces. Gotta stop here. I am super bummed. This guy used to have both Furious Charge and Precision Shot. I loved that combo. He was my go-to piece. I love building around him. He now has just the one, so he's no longer unique. Sorry, bro. Continuing. Okay, so some of the more defining cards. These two here are really, really strong pieces. Shield Spam is one of the strongest ways to run Space Marines. Unfortunately, I don't love it. Which is also another reason why Artemis is so good, because his ability, again, goes through shields. But these two, you've got Shields and Inspiring Presence, and you've got Shields and Big Game Hunter. Tor Garadon, in particular, is one of the single strongest Space Marine cards out there. You get him up to about like level 8, he's a staple piece who can really punch above his weight, is extremely difficult to remove, and then also is just very, very powerful. He's got great stats, and that Big Game Hunter makes him a threat to the big stuff, so he's very good at clearing out the scary things for the rest of your deck. Another shout out to Grimaldus, again, epic. Legendary. So he is kind of a tough card to level, but once you get up there, that combination of Fear and Inspiring Presence is extremely powerful. Another thing that I do like to think about Space Marines is they have so many different cards you can build in kind of any variety, so you want to choose multiple things to build around. So one of my favorite Artemis decks uses all Jump Marines and Bikes, because they have high initiative, so you're guaranteed to attack first. Attacking first can be a huge benefit and is a really nice way to build up the game. It does cost you, and that you're deploying first as well, which lets your opponent counterplay to you, but getting that alpha strike right in the beginning can mitigate that. And this is one of my staple pieces for playing those very, very quick attack decks. Also, shout out to this guy. If you're running pure melee, the cost to melee attack on this guy is phenomenal. This is a really strong piece in your Helbrecht decks, which I love because it's very thematic, because he is also a staple of the Black Templars. Moving on up, Fear is a really good trait to reach for. Fear, target acquired, balanced attack stats. So Morez is a very strong piece once you get him leveled up. This guy I always enjoy as a staple. He's not seeing as much play, but he's just a very balanced card, and he's about to get buffed in the upcoming season, so he's going to be a really good one. And then, of course, you've got your regen cards, which really help with the kind of durability of Space Marines, particularly good with Azrael, because Azrael wants your cards to stick around on the board for a long time. This guy is another staple piece for that, which I also love. Love the Salamanders. Love just doing the green theme deck, even if it's not all Dark Angels. This guy's a really powerful piece now that he got target acquired. That makes him a really great utility, and also just has a nice balance of ranged and melee stats. Strong piece to consider, even at that price point. This one is a really good kind of sleeper hit. You don't see him all that often, but cost to stats, phenomenal. Easy to level because he's rare. A very strong piece to consider, and again, is on a bike. He's very fast. This one, opposite, he's got very balanced stats in attack and defense, and he's got shields. A nice cheap shield piece that can hit back in both. But the downside to him is he doesn't hit very hard in either. So you want to put him in a deck that will buff his stats somewhere or another. So Azrael, Guilliman, Tol'Maron all like this guy more than the others. Already mentioned him with the regen. Of course, you've got your barrage cards, your Big Game Hunter ranged card. Those are really strong pieces you'll see a lot. Another shield card. Fear, this guy is a great piece with that Fear and target acquired. Even if you're running a ranged deck, this guy is a nice cheap piece to put in there as a counter melee, but then also as one to hold down a lane and give you kind of a cheap target acquired that's not going to go anywhere either. So it's a good combination of durability and utility that comes with this guy once you get to that secondary trait. One shout out I want to do, this is a new card, very difficult to level, but one of the first things you should reach for in a Tol'Maron deck. Very durable with the shields, has a really good base ranged attack for the cost, and good hit points to boot. So even once the shields are gone, he still can punch a lot, and will benefit from Tolmaron's trait of the boost to range damage. Another shout out to this guy, another newer card, but this is level 2, and he's already doing 53 damage with anti-infantry. Really strong piece for the cost. This one also is a nice fallback if you want to have a cheaper and kind of punchier inspiring presence. This one's a really great one to consider. See, going up, going up. This guy's about to see a buff too, so expect to look at him more. Some of the other staple pieces are going to be your fear cards. This one's great in range, this one's great in melee. This one gets a shout out for being extremely cheap. Super strong piece, also excellent in a Tolmaron deck. He doesn't gain all that much just because his starting range stat is fairly low, but he will gain some, and that's something, especially considering how long it takes to take this guy down. He's a great one to kind of fill out your Tolmaron decks with. Then this guy is one of my absolute favorites. I consider Poison to be an extremely strong trait, especially with Artemis, because Poison also goes through shields. So you've got Artemis's ability triggering, Poison triggering. You will clear a big, scary Fear shielded card much, much more quickly than you would otherwise, and he's cheap with great hit points. This guy should be considered in basically every single Space Marine deck, even if it's a melee one. Going on up, the 14-point Taunt is a staple because he's 14 points and has a bunch of hit points and has Taunt. Then your cheap Medicae. This guy is also a really good defensive piece with the shields. This guy's your 10-point Medicae. Excellent, excellent piece to reach for in any deck because he's cheap, does have actual attack stats, and will be beneficial in anything, especially for that 10 points. Then these guys you'll see fairly often just because they are the cheapest. If you can get the points, this one is dramatically better in a melee deck. But these guys all benefit all of your different warlords, with them being very great utility pieces in your Artemis decks. So you fill your Artemis deck with a couple of these guys and then some really big bruisers. They will do the damage and giving you the room to kind of soften up cards before you hit them hard. That's kind of a breakdown on Space Marines. That was a very, very quick breakdown. There's a lot I missed. There's so many cards and it's so dependent on which ones you have and what level they are that it's hard to do too much detail, but hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to go ahead and jump to Chaos now. I saved the worst for last. I love Chaos. Chaos is one of my favorite player factions. It is a great one to play. It's a really interesting and flavorful one. I have a Chaos Space Marines army on the tabletop and Meat Space, but they're kind of struggling right now in Warhammer combat cards. For your starter warlords, I would consider the Mask being probably the strongest because it is the cheapest and has an ability that's attack type agnostic, right? So anytime one of your cards is attacked, if it's above half health, it will attack first, which can actually keep your cards alive where normally they would die. Really, really strong stability piece. Downside being that the Mask itself really sucks. So once this hits the board, you're probably going to lose the game unless you're already winning dramatically, but really can help you win dramatically up to that point. So just stack a Mask deck with your top level most powerful cards and see what sticks. Another good shout out is going to be Huron. So Huron is a bit iffy. So he's expensive. His stats are not terrific, but his ability is that anytime one of your Chaos or one of your friendly cards gets a kill, it will gain back some of these attack stats of the card it killed, which is great. That can help really aggressively buff up your low attack stats or your low stat cards. Strong ability, but it does rely on your cards staying on the board for a long time, which is difficult when you're starting out, so he's kind of an iffy one to start out with. Next up is going to be your Gloggothrox the Foul. Close to cheapest, and as your cards die, your opponent's cards will get weaker. So it can be fairly strong because he does a flat damage debuff by percent every time an enemy card gets a kill. So if you're up against a card or deck that's relying on one or two really powerful cards, you just feed those some endless and taunt cards, and then you can basically ignore them for the rest of the game. It is a little bit challenging to get the most value out of that, though, because any ability that relies on your cards dying, not great. Especially since I just mentioned one who keeps your cards alive to do more attacks instead and is cheaper. So, yeah. Now, at the upper level competitive play, you will see Pure Psyker Ahriman pop up, and it's one of the more challenging decks to fight. So he is actually one of the big reasons I would include Target Acquired, Big Game Hunter, Poison, because you will have to have a way to deal with the Lord of Change that we'll talk about in a second. Skulltaker is my personal favorite of the Chaos Warlords. Absolutely love him, especially the way his ability counters Akaran, but he's melee. And melee is really struggling just in general in the game, and so while I've done fairly well with Skulltaker, he's always fighting at a disadvantage. I'm a total sucker for an underdog, though, so that kind of works out. Unfortunately, the weakest warlord in the entire Chaos faction, sorry, bro, is Abaddon. Abaddon has incredible stats himself, especially with that primary stat of Fear that helps him stick around, but he's very expensive and his stats are not that great, and he does nothing to the game until he is on the board, so until you're most vulnerable. If he gets nailed with a dead shot or a big game hunter or poison, he goes down real quick and then you're basically done. Can be really, really fun to play. I mentioned momentum decks, those aggressive decks that you play early in the season. I reach for Abaddon first because he's fun to play and you really enjoy getting him to work. He also is probably top of the list of Chaos Warlords likely to get a rework at some point and be a super heavy Warlord because he is the big bad of the Chaos faction. So a good one to play for fun. I don't consider him very competitive at a high level. You will see some like 3-card decks where it's just Abaddon and 2 really, really big Chaos Demons. That can be a lot of fun to run, but you will lose a lot of games. Just saying. To look at some of the defining cards of Chaos, of course, you've got your Greater Demons, and you have your flavor. So you've got your Bloodletter goes with your Skulltaker, being heavy melee. Keeper of Secrets has all 3 attack types and heavy range. Very good in a Huron deck because it's hard to kill. Very good in a Mask deck because it's hard to kill and also can attack back in every single attack type. The Lord of Change is arguably the most powerful of all of them, having an extremely high psychic stat and then also that Psionic Blast, so it does hit area effect every turn. This is the card you bring target acquired for. There are a number of Chaos decks that lean around the Lord of Change, and it's one you have to kill if it's on the board. You can ignore it, but it does so much damage that it's a very risky play, and if you have the tools to kill it, kill it. So that is both a defining card of Chaos and also a defining card of a meta-defining card by itself. Super strong, and I love to see that because it's a really cool piece, and Chaos needs some cards that really do kind of shape the game, both because it's Chaos and because that really kind of helps bolster the faction. Unfortunately, the Great Big Sloggoth is the weakest of the Greater Demons. If you get him up to max level, of course, he's horrifying, but he being vulnerable to Big Game Hunter, being vulnerable himself to poison, he does tend to die quickly or not impact the game based on his cost, because he doesn't have the same variety of attack types, he doesn't have an area effect attack, he doesn't have as high a melee as the Bloodletter, or Bloodthirster, that's the thing, jeez. I'm going to go ahead and skip over most of these. Shout out to these 2 for being extremely strong cards in some decks if you have them high level. Uthran is a nice budget version of the Bloodthirster, having a very high hit points, attack stats, and having Berserk. Much better at ranged attacks than the Bloodthirster, but slightly weaker on melee for a lower price point. Syl-Esk is one of the most powerful cards in the game at max level, but takes a long time to level and is not worth the points until you get it to... What are we looking at here? Pretty high up. Yeah, so you're looking there, kind of this range. It's a really powerful piece, especially in Mask decks or Huron decks. Just being a very aggressive piece itself, and then also buffing all of your friendly cards is terrific, especially for those hit points. Gonna skip over all of these because while they do have utility in some spaces, especially if they're higher leveled, they just are too expensive for what they bring, and you'll note that they're either very heavily melee focused, or they're a one-trick pony ranged card that's so expensive. Chaos doesn't really have great ranged warlords, so that's not great. If this guy or if these 2 were in any other faction, they would be staples. In Chaos, it's a little bit hard to justify their points, which is unfortunate because they're 2 of my favorite pieces on the tabletop. These 3 here are also first ones to reach for, all being fairly melee heavy, with Harkin being the most durable, having Fear, and also having a decent ranged attack. Karn being the most aggressive, having Furious Charge and a very high melee attack, and then that Death Blow once you get to that point. Great piece to include in a Huron deck because he can come onto the board, get a kill, and then immediately start bumping his stats that way, and you expect him to die. So he's one to come on the board and have an impact, and then clear the way for the rest of your cards. He's expensive for a card you expect to lose, but can be very impactful, level depending. I'll go ahead and skip these. You can do a really, well actually this one has insanely high range, but again, there aren't great warlords to do a ranged deck. You can do it. It's something I want to play with a bit, especially with Glogothrox, but it tends to fall short behind some of the ranged decks for other factions. These 2 are pieces I do reach for fairly often. This guy's about to get a buff, which I'm very excited about. And I really like that regen with both ranged and melee. Chaos has a lot of really strong regen cards, but almost all of them only have melee or ranged, not both, and most of them just have melee. This guy has a nice balance of stats and also has that secondary trait of Death Blow. He's one I kind of reach for, and is a sort of sneaky hit piece that can really make a difference. Fabulous himself is very, very strong. Really great stats for the cost, and has that top level Medicae, plus that now anti-infantry to help clear out a lot of the cards that would previously have held him up a bit. I've talked a lot about the value of fear. Most fear cards are also infantry cards, so you can look at anti-infantry as being an anti-fear tech, which is great. It's nice to have that in your deck to go ahead and kind of clear through those, because up to before that, your only real outsets against fear were target acquired, which is single use, or poison, which is high risk and slow. So anti-infantry helps your cards consistently deal bonus damage to fear, and it's a really strong utility piece to include in your decks somewhere. If you are struggling with durability, especially leveling up with a Skull Taker deck or a Huron deck, the 2 Shielded Terminators are very strong, this one being the better of the 2, but also the more expensive. Great melee stat, so he's a good piece to put in your melee decks and has shield, so he will stick around for longer. This guy also is just a great stats to cost, especially once you get him up to about this level. Really good piece to reach for to include. One of the best taunt cards in the game. One of the best barrage cards in the game. Chaos does have some really strong barrage cards, but again, they don't have a deck that really benefits ranged attacks. Not specifically, not to the point where they will outcompete others. This guy recently got a buff, and he is amazing. Great hit points, endless and furious charge, and just got a massive buff to his melee attack. So really strong one to consider. He's one I forget about because I believe his attack stat previously was something like half that. It was much, much lower. I think it was about half that. So now he hits like a tank. If they kill one copy, the new copy immediately furious charges and does a bunch of damage. So he's a fun piece. These two are very common. This guy is one of the best pound-for-pound cards in the entire game. Very good melee stat, melee ready debuff, great hit points, and fear. This guy will hold down a lane like nobody's business. Really good piece to include in any deck, especially, of course, a melee one. Neems has that Psionic Blast, but he's a card where if you play him, you expect to lose him. Very, very good, just got a recent buff, and if you have him on the board at the same time as your Lord of Change, you'll just blast away entire decks without even attacking. So, terrific piece, but high risk. This is the other Shielded Terminator I mentioned. Again, his stats are pretty good, but they don't compare to Harkon, but he's just a little bit higher than half the points. So I do end up putting him in a lot of decks just as a piece to be on my defense. Another good taunt, although one I will only take if I don't have the points for this one. And then you've got your cheap Medicae is a really great staple of Chaos. Your cheap melee target acquired. This guy, I do want to highlight this a bit. He's another strong ranged piece, but I put this guy in Psychic decks because he's cheap, he's got good hit points, he's got regen, and he also counts as a Psyker. So if you have any Psykers on the board that have that Brotherhood of Psykers where they get more powerful if you have more Psykers on the board, he's a cheap piece you can use to bolster that. And a lot of people don't realize that he's a Psyker, so I wanted to make sure to highlight that. When you get him to high level, this thing is one of the best cards in the game. 13 points for that Psychic stat and those hit points with regen. Pfft. I've played against this guy in campaigns, and it is so hard to remove this thing. Really great cheap staple to throw into your Ahriman decks to help shore up your Psychic power and also give you some more durability for the cost. For those hit points and regen at that cost, great card. New to the card pool, so probably not leveled highly, but certainly one to keep an eye on as you level it up. This guy is just about to get a balance buff, so we'll look at him later. This guy is still a fairly strong piece because he is very cheap cost and has that fear, so he's good for holding down lanes. Somewhat weaker than he used to be, but he's there. And then, of course, we get into the cheapest cards where Chaos really shines, where you've got a bunch of Endless, you've got Taunt, Endless. These are really great pieces in your Glogothrox decks. They also can be good in your other decks too, but I would not include too many of them because they will just die, and that can actually feed opposing decks. If you're up against a Helbrecht or a Badruck range deck, the last thing you want is cheap chaff cards that they can just chainsaw through and use that to do additional damage to you. Likewise, if you're up against an Eldari deck that benefits from cards dying, all of these can actually hurt you the more you have in a deck. So I would do 1 or 2, maybe 3 of these in any combination to kind of shore up your Chaos deck. That is it. I've talked about Eldari, Necrons, Space Marines, and Chaos in terms of how to ladder effectively. Hopefully that's helpful. I can take a quick look at some of the decks that I have for each of these. So we've got Zephyrblade, we looked at Lilith, we'll look at Tolmaron, see what weirdness I've got here. And some of these are a little bit strange. These may be, yeah, okay, that's a fairly standard Tolmaron. We've got a Fear range card here, we've got that Poison card here, 2 very heavy hitters plus Medicae, and then a couple fillers in there as well to kind of fill out the deck. That's a good one. That's a good kind of standard Tolmaron. Looking at the Corpse Lord, see what I have in here. And these are not cards that I level with too much. That's another really strong one. Note that several of these have regen and aggressive readies. So regen, 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 regen. So this is an incredibly durable deck because any turn where you don't want to shoot, you ready, you set up a stronger attack turn next turn, and then also all of your cards heal up a bit on top of their regen. And you could sprinkle in some Medicae here too to make that even better. So that's a good one. We talked about Manifest Nightmare. What do I have here? Yeah, okay. So really heavy on the ranged attack. Again, I don't have the really powerful, the other rounded boat, I forget what it's called, that would go in this slot. This one is somewhat weaker in a Manifest Nightmare deck because it does have that melee stat. So if this gets hit in melee, it will take full damage, so you're getting no benefit from the trait. Still extra benefit from Psychic, and also this is just such a powerful card that's fine. It works out. Also could benefit from a little bit of Medicae, but I haven't thrown that in there. So yeah, that is a praise and criticism of this deck. Let's see, Artemis. Probably doing something weird with Artemis. Artemis is one of my, oh yeah, okay, nice. Good kind of cheap melee piece. This is a very melee-centric Artemis. Got that target acquired, taunt, Furious Charge, Inspiring Presence, regen, shields. This is a really good balanced deck because all of these are about the same points cost. They all hit very, very hard. So there's no real weak point in this deck, which is one thing I really like about it. It leans on melee, but can punch in ranged, and it's just a fairly effective way to kind of play the deck. I would rebuild this and swap some of these out, so take out some of the cheaper ones and put in some more expensive ones. But we'll see. I really like that kind of balance, so anytime you lose a card, it doesn't hurt you too much. So your deck doesn't suffer too much if you have bad luck and lose one card. And that's kind of quintessential Artemis. So we got on the mask. Yeah, okay, so just leaning heavily on melee with some range thrown in here and just kind of, again, spreading out the points cost across the deck. I probably, if I was laddering aggressively with the mask, I would lean on maybe 4, maybe 5 bodyguards and go with beefier, heavier ones. Taking out these two and putting in probably taking out these two for a Lord of Change, and then seeing what else fits. Not a Lord of Change, Keeper of Secrets, because the Keeper of Secrets is so good in a mask deck. That's certainly something to consider. Let's see what I got on Glogothrox. Glogothrox has been the most powerful warlord I've gone up against, but I have struggled to find that same level of success. Part of it is level dependence, where you have a lot of really high value fear cards that are just very hard to shift, and then that stacks with his damage debuff. So if one of your cards has damage debuffed once or twice and then ends up across from a fear card, it's not going anywhere. It will just sit there and slowly die. Yeah, so there's that. And then let's see, who else did we talk about? We've got Illic. Illic's ability benefits from just hammering stuff as hard as you can with range, so very thin, maximizing that damage output as quickly as possible. This is a high-risk deck, especially now that this doesn't have Barrage anymore. So I probably would swap that out for a Barrage card, and then probably have a little bit more points to put some other stuff in here. Let's see, who else we got? We already talked about Lilith. Let's look at the Nemesaur. A Nemesaur just benefits from a balanced deck. I think this is probably going to be a heavy range deck. Yeah, so it just leans on some of my best ranged cards, a couple more flexible cards that have a little bit of ranged and melee, and then just some Inspiring Presence, and then also just a couple fillers in here, just to have them. I believe my Acheran is a themed Ultramarines deck. Yeah, so just all Ultramarines all the time. This is really effective with an Acheran deck, but it will struggle in mirror matches against Acheran, but it's very strong in others as well. So just got a balance of Inspired Presence, Fear, Shields, okay attack stats, but it sacrifices attack stats mostly for defense, and is not one of the stronger Acheran decks you could get. I just wanted to go all Ultramarines, just for fun. Let's go ahead and see. I mentioned the Ahriman deck. Yeah, so very, very heavy on the Psychers. This one is a little bit thinner. I've got this guy in here, so I can fall back on melee, so it's not just Psychic. So it's better in those mirror matches and can kind of deal with some other decks as well, but does also have a heavy variety of Psychers. The Lord of Change does not have that Brotherhood of Psychers where it's better with more Psychers on the board. So you can build a deck where it's your only Psyker, and that is fine in an Ahriman deck. So that is something to keep in mind. I did mention kind of meta-defining decks. You are going to hit Badruk, and Badruk is an extremely dangerous warlord to face. You're not going to hit him as much as you used to, but he still can absolutely stomp on you. And one of the hardest parts about Badruk is he definitely punches above his weight. So even if the cards are a little under-leveled or it's not a high trophy deck, it can beat you. And if you lose to a lower trophy deck, it really impacts your progression. So that's one of the reasons why Badruk is still a meta-defining deck, even if you don't see him as much. you do need to be able to beat him. So you need to be able to tank these hits and hit back enough to kill some of these through that taunt, through the really high hit points of these guys. So that is one of the reasons I want to make sure to keep him in mind. I believe that is it. We'll go ahead and stop there. I could talk all day, but we'll just leave it here. Hopefully this is helpful going into the final weekend of the current Votann Battle Pass season. And good luck. Got a couple more days to go.